Greetings and thank you to all of you for coming. Now, just very briefly, I'm going to speak for as little as possible and allow our guests to do most of the talking. We have a politician, a doctor, a lawyer, and me as a reporter. So between the four of us, we probably cover most of your human needs in one form or another, we hope. So we've Karyn Harty, who's a lawyer based in Dublin from Carrickfergus, Una O'Neill, a doctor originally from Derry, now living in Dublin, and Senator Malachai O'Hara from the Green Party, who is a cross-border commuter, I think it's probably fair to describe him, since his appointment to the Seanad. So before we get into questions, perhaps offer each of our guests an opportunity to introduce themselves to you and explain why we actually asked them to come here and what in their background is of interest. So perhaps we could start from left to right with Karyn.
It's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm Karyn Harty. I'm a partner with Dentons, which is a global law firm. I moved to Dublin in May 1998, just after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. I'm originally from a unionist background, grew up in Carrickfergus. To put myself in context, my grandfather was a senior figure in the Orange Order. I moved to Dublin to take up a new job in 1998, and I should also disclose that I am a nationalist by conviction. So I'm not somebody who fits into any boxes, and I'm sure we'll explore that later today.
Absolutely. Malachai.
Hello. Thank you very much. My name's Malachai O'Hara, Senator, recently appointed on the 8th of April, and excited about getting stuck into that work. I just wish people would stop calling elections. It would give me the opportunity to do, and that includes my own party with its leader and deputy leadership election at the moment. My background, I'm born and bred in North Belfast, born on the interface between the New Lodge and the Shankill Road, and that's the area that was disproportionately affected by the conflict. I grew up in that area, attended grammar school, but I left in 1998 after much enthusiasm for the agreement, but I had the opportunity to study in Birmingham, England, and I lived there for a number of years before returning to Northern Ireland. And while I was an activist, eventually I became involved with the political party, choosing the Greens. They felt to me right in my heart, my soul, my gut, and I got involved with the party, was elected as a city councillor, and unfortunately lost my seat in 2023, but then the opportunity to become a senator came up through the Green Party earlier this year, and I've taken up that role. I'm an other in terms of the constitutional questions, so, and I keep saying to both unionists and nationalists, sell it to me, what does your vision look like? I am persuadable. I'm an Anglophile, but I'm an Irishman from a Republican family, but my vote may go either way, so up to people to persuade me, and really excited about what we're going to talk about today, so thank you.
Great. And finally, Una O'Neill.
Hi, Una O'Neill, my name. I'm a GP just off Stephen's Green there. I've been working in Mercer's Medical Centre for the last 20 years, and I moved to Dublin for college to attend med school in Trinity in 1994. My older siblings had both gone to the UK to study, and that was kind of a well-trodden path. So I had assumed initially that I would probably end up going to the UK, but for I can't even remember what decision in the end, I looked south and I decided to apply to Dublin. I'd never been to Dublin, but we had spent every summer as kids going to Donegal, to Inishowen, because my mum's parents were both from there. And I kind of assumed that, you know, Dublin was a little bit like a cosmopolitan Donegal, and it isn't. And, you know, I think Donegal, I think lots of people in Donegal have relatives in the north. They've visited the north frequently, and they're much more familiar with the nuances, whereas Dublin wasn't quite like that. And so my experience was maybe a little bit of a surprise, really. So.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to try and make this as much of a conversation as possible. The motion is very clear. Northerners not welcome, ? So perhaps starting with you, and if we could just maybe address that point in terms of how often have you felt welcome, how often have you felt othered, how often have you felt deliberately unwelcome by people, or is the basic premise of the question wrong in the first place?
So I have to say I've never ever felt unwelcome. And what I would say is that as I said, when I came to Dublin, I was a little taken aback that people were, I guess, sort of surprised and unsure how to approach me. I'll tell you a story. When I was 20, I went to London to work for a summer, and I was a home help there. And toward the end of the holiday, they asked me to cover a 24-hour shift for an elderly gentleman who happened to be a guy called Lord Sanford. And their apartment was opposite Westminster Cathedral, and he was in the House of Lords, and he and his elderly wife, who'd had a very dense stroke. And I arrived in the door, and she said to me, "Oh, hello, where are you from?" And I said, "Ireland." And she looked a little shocked, and she said, "What part of Ireland?" And I said, "Well, I'm from Derry in Northern Ireland." And the flicker of her eye, it was like, oh my gosh, they've sent me a terrorist, and this person's going to be in my home for 24 hours, But actually, I'd seen that flicker before in Dublin, and it's never been an unwelcome, but it's been a sort of who are you? You're an unknown. I don't quite know, what our next steps would be. I don't quite know how to interact with you. And it was that realisation that, lots of people living in the Republic had never been to the north. Now, I hadn't been to the south very much, so I didn't know them either, but it was just that unfamiliarity that surprised me.
Karyn, as an Irish-speaking Presbyterian, I can just imagine the confusion that you've caused on a few southern ears.
Well, I didn't start out as an Irish-speaking Presbyterian. I grew up singing both verses to God Save the Queen at school and being told that I was British throughout my childhood. But, when I moved to Dublin, I never felt unwelcome. I've never felt unwelcome. I've loved it ever since I crossed the border, I have to say. But I have definitely felt other at times, and many times. And I think what I would attribute that to is it's complex. I think when you grow up in a conflict situation, particularly growing up in Northern Ireland, you're labelled. You're institutionally labelled. The state labels you as one or the other. And when I came to Dublin, I wasn't labelled anymore. And I found that very liberating. I was part of a community rather than part of two communities. But I soon realised that when people heard that you were a Protestant, they made assumptions about you south of the border, which involved tweed, and that they assumed you were an Anglican, and I'm a Presbyterian, and then they would realise that you were the worst kind of Protestant. That phrase was used, and over time I realised that actually the Protestant label didn't apply to me at all because I'm a dissenter, and I found my space. Albeit that the tribe is extremely small in the Republic because we only make up 0.2% of the population, I think. But I never felt unwelcome. But people were always slightly thrown by me. And I think to this day, I'm still inclined to stick to principle in a way that Antrim Presbyterians probably do better than anybody else, to the extent that I won't buy a product from a company that I think has a poor supply chain on principle, even if it's the most convenient thing I could do. And I think that does raise an eyebrow from people from time to time. But so culturally, I know that I am different. But I do think that the society here has matured to such an extent that that is more celebrated than it is a bad thing.
Okay. Malachai.
Yeah, I think my experience, it's somewhat limited. It's been the last few months, and I think I've been welcomed with open arms in the Oireachtas. That adage that maybe it takes a village to raise a child, and I feel like the whole village has rallied around me. But my perception is not that I'm not welcome, but it's more that and it's almost alliteration, Northerners are not known, and I think that's what others have said. Or the knowledge that people maybe have about the North is, about the violence, the conflict, and the two main tribes. And I'm someone emphatically, choosingly, that is from the other tribe, the third emerging tribe in the North. And I think people get a bit quizzical about that, or they don't understand it, or have that sort of that consciousness around the others in the North. And I think for me as well, the presumption is because I'm called Malachai O'Hara, it's an automatic aye. you're another, but you're not another, you know, and that's something that's hugely frustrating. And I think Karyn saying that about, and you know, in his experience, us being boxed very easily with a limited understanding of who we are and our fluid identities. And I think more and more of us in the North are beginning to embrace that. So my perception is Northerners not known rather than Northerners not welcome.
At what point does othering become an unwelcome act? I mean, I've had that in working in London, and there is a point at which it's ignorance, and there's a point at which it's rude. So, you know, would the experience of all three of you, and perhaps maybe even sharing the experience of other Northerners who you know here, you know, when you say not made unwelcome, is that you being generous? Let me put it that way.
Well, I'm not famous for it, but no, in all seriousness, it's really complex. And I think we always have this desire to kind of be binary about these things. And I just think it's very complex. My nana used to always say, "Oh, for the gift that God would give us to see ourselves as others see us." And I'm a big believer in trying to get into the shoes of other people and how they see me. And people do make assumptions about you. You know, so people wouldn't assume that a Presbyterian from County Antrim who grew up in my background would speak Irish. Well, I learned Irish as an adult because I felt ignorant, and I didn't like the fact that I was excluded from that part of Irish culture, and I've embraced it. And I now am blessed with 4 Gaeilge children who have beautiful Irish that I will never attain, I have to say. But are we being generous? Possibly a little bit. I mean, I have had experiences where I've been made understand that I don't quite make the club. That, yeah, Karyn, you might have learnt Irish and you might have lived here for the length of time you have, but you're not quite in the club, you know, and that has been a feature, I suppose, if I was being honest, throughout my career of not quite fitting in. And I've learned to embrace that and to see it as something that is just something that you have to process.
You mentioned in an earlier conversation about accent.
Yes.
You might share. Yeah,
well, those of you who are from the North in the audience would probably not quite be able to place me from my accent, and there's a reason for that. About 6 weeks after I moved into my new role in Dublin back in 1998, a colleague took me to the side and said, "Look, the American clients love you and the English clients love you, but I think the Irish clients are really struggling with your accent. I think you should change it." And at the time I was a bit shocked, I have to say. He was like, "How do you just change your accent?" And I went back and I talked to my flatmate, and she said, "Well, just stand in front of a mirror and make it happen. You know, what are you getting so angsty about?" And so I did. And I practiced going down at the end of my sentences instead of going up at the end of my sentences the way I did when I was from Carrick. And, you know, looking back at that experience, some people would find that a bit shocking now, that somebody would have done that, or that anybody would say to you, you have to change how you speak to fit in here. I think that colleague did me a massive favour. I'll be honest, because I think I wouldn't have built relationships with Irish clients in the way that I ultimately was able to do if I had continued to maintain my Carrickfergus accent. Now, you might think that's a good thing, you might think it's a bad thing, but I'm at peace with it, is what I would say after all these years. You know, it was something that I needed to adjust, and so I did. So now nobody can work me out, but I do have 2 children who say scone and 2 children who say scone. So I don't know what you make of that, but...
But just before I go to Una, does the othering pass down a generation to your children?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I've thought about it. Does it? I think that it doesn't. And I think that's partly a generational thing, because I find that kids these days are incredibly open to difference. They are comfortable with difference in a way that we never were. And I think that puts us in very good stead, actually, as a society. But so I don't think it does pass down.
Okay. Una, you were very funny in an earlier conversation about the experience in the clinic with pronunciations. you might share?
Absolutely. Like Karyn, you know, my accent was a bit of an issue for me in a working environment especially. So, you know, I would have to, I often, on a regular basis, ask patients about their boils. And still, you know, even though everyone's used to Northerners, they would just look at me blankly, like, what are you talking about? Or would you like a towel? And, you know, they're just, so I have to say bowel and towel. And I find myself now, even at home, saying, you know, to the kids, you know, it's time to go now. And then I say, oh, no, it's not. It's time to go now, it's time to go. So I do find that I'm slipping. I often get asked, am I from Monaghan? You know, so I'm sort of slowly going south. I think by the time I'm 80, I'll get to Cork maybe. But so, yeah, but I think, you know, I think if I was from deepest, darkest Kerry, I'd also probably have to modify my accent. And I do wonder how much of, you know, how much of the othering, you know, happens no matter what part of the country you're from. It's just that there's maybe a less of a familiarity, you know.
Malachai, your own experience?
If I can tell a quick anecdote, actually, and it's similar. When I moved to England, I was delighted that my house had a power shower, right? And people in England were, what? All right? So it's a power shower, right? So I slowed down and I enunciated, and then I think in politics, you have to be clear about being articulate and using words appropriately. But I occasionally lean into my broad Belfast accent at times. And when the passion rises, that comes back out automatically. I think I don't call it a bottle, I call it a battle, right? And that's the language of Belfast. So I think what's also interesting is when you meet other Northerners, we almost, and I feel regressive almost doing it, but we do that with little dance of sourcing each other's identity, of how we say H or H, where we might call place names, and we can do that, and we can almost spot each other and guess each other's community background, and it's something that's almost built into us that I try to reject, but it still keeps coming back, I think is fair to say.
It's so interesting you say that, because I think that actually, south of the border, people are much more direct about that. But if you're from the north, from our generation, you kind of do it in an indirect way. So I can remember being asked in my early days here, what does your father do? And being utterly shocked by that question. Now, I was from a working class background. My father was an amazing man who had done everything from being a merchant seaman to working as an engineer in a fencing factory. But you know, and made redundant several times along the way by multinationals. But you would never ask in Belfast, what does your father do? And I think there is something here about people like to be able to place you. So they're curious and they want to know I always say, you know, the square mile of land you're from. They want to work that out. And with Northerners, it's really hard to do that. And I think that sometimes contributes to the slight other point that we've talked about you just being a bit different, because they can't quite place you in the way they'd like to be able to. And in the north, you know, you would ask things like, what school did you go to? And you instantly have a fair grasp of whether somebody's in one box or the other, and, you know, where did you grow up? But you would never specifically ask the question.
But would you think that people in the south are asking that question with the intention to box you? Because I think most southerners ask that question because of a desire to make connection.
I completely agree, and I think we sometimes take it up wrongly.
Yeah, when you mentioned earlier, you know, about the othering, and I think, like in my line of work with my patients, it's all about connection. And, you know, I often find, you know, I'll be discussing something with my husband who's from Kerry, and, you know, I'll say, oh, do you remember the Wombles, you know, that TV programme when we were kids? And he'll just look at me blankly and go, no, you know, we didn't have BBC. I have no idea what you're talking about. And it's that kind of connection that you try to make with people, that commonality. Like back to Lady Sanford, after she took her hand slowly away from the phone, she you know, she sort of said to me, oh, what are you doing in London? And I said, oh, I'm on holiday. I'm a student. What are you studying? Medicine. Oh, okay. And then where are you studying? And I said Trinity College in Dublin. And she said, oh, my daughter Babs went to Trinity. And then I was her best friend, and it was because I'd made that connection with her. And I think that the thing that's maybe missing a little bit from, say, coming from the north as opposed to coming from Cork is that there's just less of a commonality, less of a shared experience, and I think that's changing.
How much of Southern attitudes towards Northerners is based upon who they actually see down south, and how much of it is based on class rather than on religion or culture? Malachai?
Yeah, I think in our earlier conversation we talked about class a lot and experience of class. So, and I think the consensus was that, you know, the Southerner or the Northerners who come south tend to be from that broad acronym of the Catholic, Nationalist, Republican community, both working class and middle class or aspiring middle class. And the people from the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, broadly, but not exclusively, those people who come south tend to be from a more middle class element, and working class Unionists, that broad term, might prefer to go to other parts of the UK and mainland GB. So I think there is a distinct class element to it as well. I also just think about the placing of people. There's that natural curiosity to build that connection and identify a commonality. But there's also maybe something about jockeying for a hierarchical position with someone. You want to know what their family did, where they're from, what school they went to, what their professional career might be, what their educational attainment might be. So you get that people can sometimes get that sense of where they are with someone else. And I think that's something that maybe we don't do as much in the north, because we have another barrier, which is about that community identity that maybe has evolved here that we don't do.
Yeah, I mean, I think just what you mentioned there about trying to kind of put people, you know, try and work out where people are. I think a big benefit in the north is the grammar school system, because, you know, it's much easier here in Dublin, for example, to work out, you know, by where somebody lives and what school they went to, you know, roughly where they are in a kind of the class system. But in the north, you kind of lose that because of the grammar school system. So that's, you know, a really interesting difference, I think.
I think that's true. I will say that Derry Girls has done a lot. That wonderful episode of Derry Girls where they're doing the cross-community thing and they have to write up on the board all the things they have in common. And I put a thing on LinkedIn this week about this event, and I said, and no, I don't keep my toaster in the cupboard. Because I'm frequently asked that question, I have to tell you. But I actually think that, you know, things like that where people can understand what it was like. I mean, I can remember being at cross-community events, not dissimilar to that, you know, and so I think that does help people to understand us, I think, a bit better.
Yeah, but it is striking. I mean, I've had the experience on more than a few occasions seeing Ulster GAA supporters coming down in July, August or September for All-Ireland quarterfinals, semi-finals and finals on occasions. And in fact, too often in finals in some ways, for speaking as a Corkman. And actually, you will always hear complaints from them, you know, that they have been made to feel unwelcome by somebody. And it isn't, you know, what necessarily Southerners would see as northern chippiness, or at least it isn't always northern chippiness. Sometimes the actual reaction is actually perfectly well justified. And some of it is based on class. You know, you've got maybe northern, the banter is slightly more aggressive than the south. No harm meant by it, but it's more in your face. And Southerners tend to find that a little uncomfortable on occasions. Would you agree or disagree? Malachai, perhaps, or Runa? Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, there's definitely a class element to, I mean, in any society, in any city, in any country, you know, class plays a massive part in accent, and, you know, I think that's misinterpreted from the north a little bit to be aggressive whenever it's just, as you say, banter, you know. And I do wonder as well, you know, growing up in the 80s whenever and the 90s, whenever they used to dub Gerry Adams' voice, and you had that sort of angry northern accent, and I just wonder, you know, do people associate that accent with aggression and violence, and, you know, and it probably didn't help.
Yeah, I'm thinking about my experience the last sort of 4 months or 3 months in the Shannon, and lots of the staff make a presumption that I'm a Shinner. right? I mean, I keep having to explain that as Greens, we're an all-island party. And then I think, are you being dead broad? Is that the North Belfast coming out in you? And I don't want to say ameliorate my accent, but I kind of do at times. So I think that's interesting. And you know, maybe a presumption about the Green Party, about, you know, we knit our own with lentils, our own sandals, and, you know, we're middle class do-gooders. Where my politics are very much social justice and class based. So I think that's an interesting element. I also think culturally, one of the differences in the north and the south, and I think, you know, you talked about it with the Wombles. You know, we watch the BBC as our main news. Now, when we had a caravan in Warren Point, we had an aerial in the back of a black and white TV to pick up RTE. But my dad used that for the sport. You know, it wasn't really for the news or current affairs. It was for the GA. So I think there are huge cultural differences between the north and south in terms of our diet around culture. I know that's changing in a globalised context, but for us, maybe growing up, we watched the BBC, we watched Channel 4 when it came online, you know, where we didn't watch RTE. We read different papers. We read the Belfast Telegraph or the Daily Mirror, or hopefully not the Sun, where in the Republic there were different papers. So there's something around that is culturally very distinct. And, you know, part of humour is making culturally appropriate jokes. And sometimes they fall flat. So that's been my experience, and that's back to Northerners not known.
So what's really interesting about that is there was very little BBC in my house because we were an ITV household. So there was ITV on the television and Downtown Radio on the radio. And the BBC was considered a bit posh, a bit middle class. So isn't it extraordinary that you think that we grew up within miles of each other and our cultural experience even then was so different, you know? And I find that really interesting because my mother, who's still going strong, 81, never approved of BBC Two and Channel 4. She considered them to be inappropriate at most times. And us behaving badly in the house involved us switching on BBC Two when she wasn't in the house and then desperately racing to turn it over again whenever she was coming back. So, but my husband, who's from Cork, didn't have those channels growing up, and, you know, so you're absolutely right. There are things that you have to learn, like Wondery Wagon or whatever it's called, and so on, that weren't part of our growing up.
What do you say to family and friends when you go back north? And just as importantly, what did they ask you about living in the Republic?
Well, my two younger siblings actually ended up at certain points living. My sister followed me down to Dublin to study because she studied to be a vet, and that was the only place in Ireland that you could do it. So it wasn't specific that she'd wanted to come to Dublin, but I texted them actually at the weekend to see, you know, what were your experiences, and neither of them. My brother worked in Mayo for a couple of years, and neither of them felt in any way unwelcome.
But
I would say.
The broader family links who haven't come south, what would those people say to you? Would it even come up in conversation?
It doesn't really come up, Mark, to be honest. Okay. You know, it's just, I think that people, you know, my relations from Derry just think they're Irish, you know, and it just doesn't occur to them that perhaps they're not as Irish as they think they are, you know, honestly.
I was at a meeting of the SDLP's New Ireland Commission recently in Malachai in Derry, and a really interesting night, but I was talking to quite a few of the members afterwards, and it was really striking. Two of them almost simultaneously said the same thing to me in a fairly vigorous conversation. And they said, you know, the problem with you lot, meaning me as a representative of all Southerners, was that he said, when we go south, we're not going to a different country. And when you lot come north, you think you are in a different country.
I'd often get patients saying to me, you know, often patients not from Ireland at all, saying, oh, what part of Ireland are you from? Again, trying to kind of make a connection. And I'd say, oh, I'm from Derry, you know. And they say, oh, right, so you're British. And I kind of go, oh, yeah, you know, because I don't really want to say, well, actually, I think I'm Irish, or, you know, I have an Irish passport. I just kind of make a noise and then we all move on, you know. But there is a sort of, you know, well, you're not 100% Irish. You might be 95%, but you're not quite. People just don't know.
Would you find that insulting?
Well, it's not how I see myself. But I mean, my first passport was actually a British passport because I needed to travel, and I was 18 and it was cheaper actually, and that's why. And it was all a very pragmatic reason, and I didn't feel like I was in some way a traitor.
It was a travel document.
It was just a travel document. It's just what I could get. Yeah. You know, and I now have an Irish passport, but, you know, so I'm not offended by it, but I do think that, like, when a patient says it to me, it's a little bit presumptuous, perhaps, but I know they don't mean harm by it. So, you know, I just move on.
Yeah, I again, this is complex, but I've noticed since Brexit, there is a component of the unionist community in Northern Ireland who have got quite Trumpian in their perspectives, I would say, and would say things to me like, "You're very permissive down there in the south. You know, there's a sort of a slippery slope kind of perspective on the Irish have kind of gone to pot." Not in a good way, as they would see it, that we're far too liberal in our perspectives. And I find that fascinating because it didn't used to be what they would say. And I don't know, you know, so I remember a good friend saying to me not that long ago, "What newspapers do you read?" And I said, "Well, I read the Financial Times and the Guardian and the Irish Times and the New York Times." She rolled her eyes to heaven and she said, Are you really telling me that's where you get your news? And she told me there was a website that I should really be getting my news from. And I looked at it and it was, you know, what I would consider to be a very right-wing website. I was a bit shocked. And I understand this is now fairly mainstream within the unionist community in Northern Ireland. So I think that is something that people have missed entirely as a dynamic. And I think it's something that is an interesting development. I wouldn't want to be judgmental in relation to it, but I'd just say that is definitely a perception among the unionist community, which people maybe aren't aware of.
And Karyn, I, if I can build on that, there's a gentleman by the name of Wallace Thompson, who's a founder of the DUP, who caused a bit of a stir last year and then followed it up with a political interview recently, talking about United Ireland being inevitable and being pragmatic about that. But he's an arch social conservative, and he feels that, inversely almost to some of what you're saying, that he feels that making alliances with social conservatives in the Republic, in a new Ireland, gives them more strength than in a liberal or permissive Britain. Now, my perception is that the Republic is very liberal and permissive as a society. So I think that's an interesting shift within an element of unionism. If I could just say what Northerners say to me when I go back up. So my aunt came down, working class woman, born and bred Falls Road, and she came down when I was inaugurated. And afterwards, she tortured me for days saying, "Mal, you and your husband should move to Dublin because it's much friendlier for gay people." Now, I've never really had negative experiences in the North, which is lucky, and I know that's not necessarily true for everybody in the LGBTQ community. So that was interesting. My friends, about social opportunities, if I go into Belfast to eat on a Tuesday night, I have to have my restaurant booked. I have to know where's opened, where I can come out of the Doyle and I can just walk down the street and likely find somewhere fantastic to eat. So there's something about those opportunities. And then the politicos say to me, "How's the Senate going?" And my answer, my refrain so far has been, it's strange, for all its flaws, to be part of a functioning democracy. You know, the story of the North is since 98, 26 years, half the time we've had no executive crisis, collapse, we've no money, we can't do anything, we won't make tough decisions, etc., etc. And it was when Leo Varadkar resigned that he said something that sat with me. And I went, while I might not be a fan of a lot of his politics, he said that Ireland's had functioning democracy for over 100 years, quite a mature democracy in terms of the global perspective. And I have seen things move from week one. It goes through committee stages. It's off to the president, signed into law. It's going to be in effect. A legislative schedule, a programme for government, a budget, it helps when we have a good surplus. My experience when I worked in the Assembly was nothing moved. The polity was frozen or difficult or couched in collapse all the time.
So what happens when you say to some of those people that Dublin has a functioning system and Belfast doesn't?
See, and that's the immediate kind of, are you boxing yourself into stop being another and become a nationalist? Yeah. I think actually the answer in that is reform of the institutions in the North. We're approaching 30 years of the Good Friday Agreement. We need to mature, and it should be citizen-led as well.
That's taken, but how did they react when you're making a negative comparison between Stormont and Dublin?
Interesting, but the nationalists will go, well, come on, you know what the answer is. The others will say, pause for reflection, and the unionists will often bite back to say, oh, well, the UK is a functioning democracy.
Yeah.
So, you know, first past the post is only used by Belarus and the UK in Europe. So, you know, a guess of that what you want. So you almost get those three varied perspectives from politicos.
Much of the debate over the last while has been about the whole issue of whether there should be a unity referendum. If there is, when should it happen, preparations, etc. I mean, all three of you have almost unique experiences in some ways. What would your own general view be on the debate? Not necessarily offer an opinion on the issue if you want, but in terms of what you've seen of the debate, do you think people in the South, 70% of whom say in opinion polls that they want a united Ireland, do they actually want it? Do they want it with the same fervour that we claim to have?
Some of them don't seem to want it as much as I want it, I have to say, and I kind of find that fascinating. I think that the financial piece comes up a lot. So there is a genuine concern people have about the cost of a united Ireland and how that would work. And I think that's a valid concern that needs to be really thought through and planned for and addressed. But I think there's then a less tangible issue, which is this sort of concern that people have about trying to incorporate people who don't want to be there, almost, you know, and that's, again, a very valid concern. If you've been brought up being taught British history, as I was, in a school singing the British national anthem, and all your postboxes are red, and you believe you're part of the UK, there's quite a jump to be made there in terms of feeling at home in Ireland, in a united Ireland, and I think that is a task that is going to be difficult but not impossible. But what it will require, in my view, is a bit of movement. So I think for those who say we want a united Ireland, they have to be prepared to adjust. So, for example, I grew up in a society where flags, as we call them, were, you know, and still are a big feature. You know, the tricolour or tricolour, whatever your perspective is, when I was a child was a scary thing. It was something I was scared of because it was brandished. I now very much embrace my Irish identity and I'm very comfortable with the Irish flag, but there are many people who aren't. How much does it matter? If you could achieve a united Ireland, how much do those symbols matter? And I think that's a conversation that will have to be had.
For me, you know, it all boils down to connection, and it's interesting, Mal, what you said about, you know, the DUP. I mean, I don't forging kind of links with their sort of like-minded sort of social policy colleagues in the South. I mean, that's not where I come from socially, you know, social policy-wise. However, I think that, you know, it's all about relationships and links, and, you know, Mal is down, you know, in the Senate, so you have that sort of Green Party all island representation, and I think that's what needs to happen. I mean, unionists in the North need to feel represented in some way, you know, so I don't know whether that means involving sort of unionists within the Oireachtas in some form, because if you feel that you're not being seen, like what we talked about coming down and not known, then you don't feel welcome. And just like I don't particularly like being told I'm British. You know, I doubt there's a unionist in the north who will want to be told, well, no, you're Irish. So, you know, it's the same, just in a reverse.
But analysing the Southerners that you know, work with, meet, live near, what sense do you think they have about a United Ireland debate? Is it one that they want to have, or is it one that they want to have like St. Augustine someday, but not now?
Yeah, you know, interestingly, Mark, I've never actually asked, and I think that might be because I'm from the north and people might feel a bit scared to have that conversation with me. And maybe that's only my perception. But I think that my feeling is that intellectually Southerners like the idea that it's physically in all Ireland, and then therefore politically that's what I feel. But I think if you said to them, well, you know, in Germany, whenever they reunified, you know, the West Germans had to pay X amount extra in tax, I suspect that you may have a drop off in numbers of people interested in a United Ireland. Then I suspect when it comes down to the nitty gritty practicalities, no, I don't know.
Okay, Mal?
Yeah, and I agree with my colleagues on the panel. I think in the South there's this kind of romanticised, nostalgic, wouldn't United Ireland be lovely? Now, 2 million rambunctious, fractured Northerners with our post-generational trauma, our endemic poverty, you know, suddenly land into the state. That's a reality that really hasn't been grappled with. And I think, you know, for all the romantic talk about it, we really need to have a rational, long conversation about what a United Ireland might look like. I'm a fan of citizens' assemblies, I think, in terms of what they did with marriage and abortion, presidential rights. It provoked a societal discourse, and we cannot repeat the mistake of Brexit. You know, Brexit, for the 17.4 million people who voted for it, Brexit meant 17.4 million different things because each of them had a unique perspective, because we never really understood exactly what Brexit meant. And then we saw the trauma of that over the best part of a decade. And in the north, that led to political instability, no institutions for 5 out of 7 years, fractured community relations, some interface violence, you know, and all of those challenges. So I think for Southerners, there needs to be that wider societal debate. But I think in the north, I would encourage my unionist friends, you need to engage with this debate, because I can only act as an undefined other on the constitutional question to try and be as fair an arbiter as possible in the conversation. But the people best placed to be to argue for unionism are unionists, not me.
But on that point, I mean, we were talking to a lot of people in the north this week for a piece we're publishing on Saturday. And we'll go to questions shortly, by the way, so perhaps a couple of you might think of what you'd like to ask. But why would somebody from a unionist background who doesn't want to have the outcome engage in the conversation? If you're a unionist and a strong unionist, and if you want Northern Ireland to remain as part of the United Kingdom, the argument is from that quarter is that they are conceding some ground by conceding the premise of the question.
And that is a fair point, but I would say cover your bases. Because if the ground moves and you haven't engaged in the conversation, you're coming from far behind. So pragmatic unionists should engage with the conversation, because if they don't, something may evolve or take shape. Now, the other thing I would back to nationalists is in 1998, nationalism scored 42% of the vote. Last week, nationalism scored 42% of the vote. The people who grew with the others. My political identity. And unionism dropped and has been below a majority for a long time. In 1998, the party with the biggest vote in the north was the SDLP. You know, so we've already had the genie out of the bottle where a nationalist party won the popular vote. We've had a nationalist first minister or Republican first minister since May 2022. So there are genies that are out of the bottle, and psychologically for unionism, it lost its majority at the Assembly, lost its majority at councils, lost its majority at the Westminster elections 5 years ago. So there has to be a grappling within pragmatic unionism that says we are in a position where things may change, and if we don't engage with the debate, we may be left behind, and that becomes a real challenge.
And that's a conversation for unionism to have with people who classify themselves as others, really, isn't it?
I think it is, and I suppose I'd make 2 observations about that. One is that I actually hear a conversation going on in the unionist community in Northern Ireland, which is, I think, resigned now largely to the fact that it's only a matter of time. And I think that's interesting because that's a shift. I think the second thing, though, is I have always been a massive supporter of the Good Friday Agreement, but it is inherent in the Good Friday Agreement that it brings the poles together, and the middle ground isn't really catered for in the Good Friday Agreement. And I think the challenge that Northern Ireland faces at the moment politically is that there's nothing in the Good Friday Agreement to allow for the middle ground, that on my reading of it. And nobody wants to be the person to suggest renegotiating the Good Friday Agreement, but it seems to me that's probably going to happen at some stage. And another thing that's tied into that, which I think is something that will have to be addressed, is that Northern Ireland economically is not functioning. So something like 68% of the economy is public sector employment in Northern Ireland. That's obviously very different to the economy here. That again is something that needs to be thought about. You know, that's a byproduct of the peace process, but it's also something that will cause barriers potentially. So that's going to need to be considered.
I mean, I would agree with both Mal and Karyn. I think we were very aware growing up that Northern Ireland is a numbers game, and you know there was a sort of almost a joke, you know, like the more babies you have, the sooner we get to majority, you know, and you know it was a bit tongue in cheek, but actually there was a degree of truth to it, you know, and I suspect that like as you're talking about, Karyn, the unionists are looking at the numbers now and they're sort of saying, well, you know, we don't necessarily hold the balance of decision-making power over the next 10, 20 years, you know. So you would hope that there might be some engagement even just based on the numbers.
But they're also still sending their babies to college in the UK who don't come back. And, you know, when I went to Queen's, I was criticised for staying in Northern Ireland because it was expected that I would go away. And I was invited back to my old school to do the prize giving there a few years ago, and I interviewed the sixth years as to where they were going to college, and almost to a person they were going to the UK. So the unionist community sends away its talent and then can't understand why its numbers are dropping.
But just from a southern audience point of view, just explain that point. Why were you criticised for not going to British universities?
Well, I was told.
And why would so many people coming from a Protestant background do that?
I was told that Queen's would be a cold house for a Protestant, and it's fair to say there was something in that in terms of my experience, although I got a great degree, but it wasn't the most comfortable place to go to college at the time, from my perspective. That has changed immensely, and Professor Ian Greer, who's in charge of Queen's now, has done a huge amount of work to really change that. But to your second question, that's really, I don't understand why young Protestants from Northern Ireland, and they're invariably Protestants, leave Northern Ireland to go to college. But they do it in their droves. And it has been, and it's consistently a feature. It's really almost standard. So I don't understand it, but it is very much a feature.
I don't know if it's just unionists. I mean, 3 out of the 5 of us, you know, kids moved to the UK on finishing school. Mal, you went to the UK. So actually, I think it's Northern Ireland's best and brightest head off, you know, be it south or across the border for the most part, which is such a shame, you know, because it does polarise the society more, you know, losing.
We did a piece with Northern students in third level recently for our weekend magazine, and it was quite striking, both the piece and the reaction to it. And it is very difficult for Northern students to come south because of the way in which the CAO figures are computed. You have to have 4 A-levels, and you can't get 4 A-levels. So it's quite difficult, and there's a certain unwelcome tone from southern universities. And then you see, in contrast, there's a distinct uptick in the number of southern students going to Belfast, to such an extent that it's actually now beginning to become a bit of a problem from the point of view of access for northern students.
Do you know, when I came to Dublin in '94, there was two northern fellas, one did law and one did psychology, and they were sort of in classes. I had friends in both of those classes, and they set up the Unionist Party in Trinity, the first Unionist Party. So they were, big Unionists, moving to Dublin, feeling very comfortable, perhaps in sort of, some kind of Carson shadow, but really comfortable. Everyone, the Southerners couldn't understand how we could all go for pints and be friends, coming from different communities. And in fact, I'm not sure that if we went back up north, how much we would have hung out, but certainly in Dublin, any differences, and nobody had a problem with them setting up the Unionist Party.
Yeah, but you probably almost certainly wouldn't have associated with each other.
Probably not. And I actually just looked them up on LinkedIn there during the week to see where they are, and neither of them are in the Republic or in the North. So,
Right. Okay, let's go to questions if we have one or two people who want to contribute. It's a fair point, but just to be aware that the structure of this was to tap into Northerners who were living here or who have daily or frequent contact with life on a daily basis in the North. So it's a slightly different set of people that we were trying to find.
Can I?
Absolutely, please.
I just want to respond to a point that was made earlier. I don't think we picked up on too much, but about the size of the public sector in the North, and the point that, was it Mary? Sorry, did I? You lady there from County Down, about I live in North Belfast. I live in a working class part of it, but the Upper Antrim Road around the castle and the zoo, very well-to-do middle-class Catholics who have very well-paid civil service jobs or public sector jobs, and if part of the argument about a United Ireland is cutting away large swathes of that public sector, you might see a bit of a change in some people's opinions. And the other thing, Andy, just on your point is, and I keep saying this to my unionist friends, who is selling me a version of the union, because I'm open, that is about the Chartists, the suffragettes, about the Labour tradition, about the NHS, about radical, liberal, progressive UK, when instead unionism, all four parties of unionism are selling me a version that is, I am a subject of an unelected king and I must fawn to that outdated mode of democracy. Nobody is selling me a different version of it, where I think nationalism broadly has more acutely aligned itself on issues of social justice, and is selling me a version of a republic that is a modern liberal democracy and potentially like a northern Scandinavian model or a northern European model of a small nation state that is liberal, has a good welfare state, the gap between the rich and the poorest is reduced. They're selling me a version of that, but unionism's not, so persuade me.
And I would also add that I have to say nobody asked me whenever I was asked to take part in this what my political stance was. And perhaps people might be a bit surprised, given my background, that I am a nationalist. So it's possible that maybe part of the thinking was that I would give that perspective, and I'm terribly sorry to disappoint everybody that I can't.
I think you're 100% right. I think there's a big lack of knowledge about Southerners, about Northerners, but also Northerners about Southerners. When I was about, 20, I went to Galway with my then boyfriend, and I asked him, do you go through Kerry to get to Galway? And he just looked at me, and I knew I'd said something really, really stupid immediately. But I didn't know anything to do with Irish geography. I'd never learned it in school. I'd never learned Irish history. I knew, actually, when I thought I was Irish, but I knew nothing about Ireland really. And I think there's a lot of scope to teach Northerners about the Republic and vice versa. I would be a big fan of aligning education systems and, just learning more about each other before even any United Ireland is discussed.
But perhaps maybe even bring people in from the floor. That's an interesting point. And if you look, we're 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and if you look at the traffic on the M1, and if you exclude the southbound northern traffic going to Dublin Airport and to IKEA, right? I've made this point before, and one or two people didn't like it, but if you exclude that traffic and then ask yourself what's left, in terms of there being real engagement. Southern traffic going north, okay, it's going to the Titanic Quarter, it's going to the Glens of Antrim, it's going to the Causeway. Again, what other parts of Northern Ireland are Southerners seeing? And if you exclude the traffic along the border, the 5-10 mile commuting traffic from Louth all the way to Donegal, you know, the level of engagement north and south is still pretty woeful. I covered all of the Drumcree years, and I remember the year of the Quins, children being killed. I was working for the Examiner in Cork at the time, and we did a 2-page long magazine read on it. And I was back down in Cork in my home pub in North Cork, and it was like Livingston had returned from Africa. You know, I mean, they saw this place as just being incredibly foreign, and didn't understand the basic rules of the game. And if I'm not sure that that's hugely changed in 25 years, you know, maybe I'm wrong.
No, I don't think you're wrong. The one thing I will say to you, though, is something that's much misunderstood about Northern Unionists is the disdain they have for the English football team. And I can tell you that I haven't spoken to my mother this morning, but she'll be rolling her eyes saying, we'll never hear the end of it. So I don't know if that gives you any comfort as to...
Mal?
I'm an Anglophile. I went to Birmingham in 1998. My first boyfriend was an RAF reservist part-time at a time when he would have been kicked out of the army, should that have been the kind of don't ask, don't tell before the European judgment in the early noughties. So I'm an Anglophile, and same conversation in my family WhatsApp group last night. Oh, we'll never hear the end of it. Oh, it's coming home. I prefer Vindaloo. I think it's the best English football song. But I'm quietly supporting England. Now, I don't know whether I want them to win. I think I'm happy for them to get to the final. And I have a lot of time and respect for Gareth Southgate. And I think England have a better squad. Spain have been on better form anyway. But and my challenge to my siblings is, if you don't want to hear about it, don't consume the media. You know, change your media and hear something else. But I think English jingoism is going to ramp up the next few days, and it'll be quite intolerable. So, yeah.
You know? No. I remember I was London editor in a previous life for the Irish Times, and I was asked to go to an Ireland-England Wembley International late. So couldn't get a ticket. So ended up getting, I think, the last ticket that was available on the in the English supporters camp. And Ireland scored after 15 or 20 minutes. Can't remember who scored. And I stood up to cheer, and then I realised where I was, and I kind of half froze. At which point, everybody around me realised what had happened and exactly what thought was going through my head. At which point, they laughed and made me look very foolish. So, I mean, you know, those kind of things are always interesting in terms of identity. And, you know, it's striking growing up. I remember in Cork when, you know, talking to old farmers in Cork in the 70s and 80s, and they'd still talk about the English rugby team coming in 72, you know, and the deep impact that made on a whole generation of people. You know, the Scots wouldn't come, the Welsh wouldn't come, the French wouldn't come, but the English came. And, you know, we do exaggerate our differences in some ways. You know, I remember in 2011 when in advance of the Queen coming, and I was based in London, and the embassy was doing some events with royals to almost sensitise the paddies to be in the presence of royalty. It was kind of funny in many ways. But Prince Charles at the time and his wife, the Duchess, came, and terribly proper, and they were supposed to stay for an hour, and the courtiers were being terribly courteous, and they separated and were meeting people, and the courtiers walked in front of the Duchess and said, "Make way for the Duchess," at which point every Irish person in the room turned around and laughed. And there was this 10 seconds of horrified silence on the part of diplomats everywhere, wondering what was going to happen next, at which point Prince Charles and the Duchess roared laughing, and they stayed for nearly 5 hours, you know. So we do have that opportunity to make connections, and we've had a horrible decade, you know, with a lot of unnecessary damage done. And one can hope that perhaps we're on the other side of it with some goodwill on everybody's part.
very much do. Yeah, and actually, it has been suggested to me in the past that it's something that we should mobilise, and I think that given, ignorance is a terrible thing. And I think part of the problem that we have identified here is ignorance on both sides, of the border about the other side of the border. And I think if we could help to bridge that, I think that would be a very good thing.
Okay, I think that might... Please,
just one thing, and I meant to say it earlier, and I think it's interesting. It might tie back to the brain drain from people from Protestant backgrounds, but all the attitudinal stuff in the North would say that the most liberal on social issues are people from Protestant backgrounds. And I think what's interesting is in the last decade in the Republic with the abortion and marriage referenda is that an old perception of the Republic being priest-ridden, illiberal, the priest will come round and bless your house even if you don't want him to. That has shifted hugely in the last couple of decades. Economic growth, diversity, all of those things. So there may be people who are from a more socially liberal Protestant background who are beginning to look at this Republic and go, maybe I do fit in there.
Okay. All right, I think we've reached the end of our clock. I've probably gone over it, I suspect. So perhaps you'd say thank you to our guests, to Karyn Harty, to Una O'Neill and to Malachai O'Hara.
Thank you all very much, and thank you to Mark for such expert sharing. I just wanted to draw your attention and hope that you might follow up some of the threads that were mentioned. So you mentioned Wallace Thompson. He came down and he gave a fantastic interview here, and I really encourage you to go back and watch that on our website. And then this idea of connection, how well do we know each other? There's some work being done in the polling surveys that we've done with the Irish Times. So you can find that on the website as well. How often do people cross the border? Do they have friends? All of those kinds of things have been dug into a little bit on that. And then on how much would it cost? We've got a few articles on that. Paul Nolan has one. And a couple of others. And then that idea of the brain drain of people leaving. John Fitzgerald has written an academic article on that. And that is actually his core belief, that it's at the education level that both Northern Ireland would flourish if many of those people returned in the way in which many people come back to Ireland. Even if they go abroad, they often come back. And so he's comparing those stats and seeing how many come back here and how many come back to Northern Ireland. It's an interesting paper. And yeah, we've lots of blogs on identity as well that you might like to pick up on. So thank you all very much. Lunch is served. Please thank the speakers one more time.
Thank you.